What do you do when you stand in the valley of the shadow of death and it seems as though God has turned his back on you? What do you do? Like Abraham, after you have waited 25 long, dreary years for a son, and now your son is here, and God is saying to you, go offer him a sacrifice. What do you do when the pains of sickness and disease seem to ravish your body and all your prayer and cry for healing seems to be going nowhere? What do you do when you feel as though you are in bondage? Bondage to the enemy. And finally, liberation comes. But not too long thereafter, it seems as though you are in bondage of another kind. Well, let us look at the experience of the children of Israel and see what they did. Let us see if we can pattern our lives after them or learn from their experience so that we can be strengthened in our Christian walk. The children of Israel ended up in Egypt in the time of Joseph, when that great famine was upon the land. And so they spent roughly 430 years in Egypt. You would remember that in Egypt they were made slaves by one of the pharaohs. Their task was difficult, and year after year they reached out to God for a deliverer. There was hope as they talked one with the other about this deliverer, this promised deliverer to come. But generation after generation fell asleep without the realization of this one who would come to free them. But God finally called Moses, a prince of Egypt, who was driven or ran from Egypt because he killed an Egyptian. God called him when he was busy looking after the sheep of his father-in-law. And there God kept him for 40 years. He had some things to unlearn, and God had lots of things to teach him. God sent him back to Egypt. And there in Egypt, he confronted Pharaoh. And you know the story very well. God afflicted Egypt with 10 plagues. For Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused over and over to let God's people go. But finally, the day came when he agreed because God put to death his son with all the firstborn of Egypt. The children of Israel marched out of Egypt, singing a song of victory, singing a song of freedom. Finally, they were no more slaves, but they were free men, free women, free boys, free girls. God led them to the shores of the Red Sea. He led them to the Red Sea, where on both sides we had mountains. One person said there were a wilderness on one side. Before them stood the Red Sea. Soon an alarm was raised. The Egyptian army was in hot pursuit. You see, Pharaoh had changed his mind. Pharaoh was now second thinking his decision. Who would build our houses? Who will build our temples? And I could imagine he went on and on. And finally, they decided, let's go and bring the let's go and bring Israel back. Israel was now lodged at the Red Sea. Sea before them. They couldn't go to the right. They couldn't go to the left. And over 1 million people stood there wondering what will happen. They prayed for freedom, for deliverance, for centuries. And now they were liberated. And their liberation seemed to be short-lived because the enemy of the armies of Egypt was in hot pursuit. They complained. They murmured. They questioned. They wanted, at least some of them, wanted to put Moses to death. What a foolish leader to bring them to the Red Sea where they were trapped. But you see, friends, they forgot that God was leading. They forgot that Moses acted under strict direction from God. What do we do when trouble seems to be lurking? Do we complain, murmur, fret, accuse our leaders, and the like? Moses had to face this great multitude of people. Free, no more slaves. But can we really say that? Because even though they were free, they acted and behaved like slaves. Moses heard from God, and God had a plan of deliverance. You see, their deliverance from Egypt was just the first part of God's deliverance plan. Because even though they were free from Egypt, the army of Egypt, and Egypt was the ruling power of that day, they were still very much alive. And at any time, their actions could threaten the freedom of Israel. And so Moses said something very remarkable to the children of Israel in this situation. Come with me to Exodus, the second book of the Bible, chapter 14 and verse 13. Exodus chapter 14 and verse 13. And Moses said unto the people, fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show to you today. Watch this now. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. The Lord shall fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. So while they were in turmoil as to what is happening, as to where do we go from here, while they were actually threatening the life of their leader Moses, God through Moses gave them the blessed assurance that the Egyptians who they see now, they will never see again. My friends, when God grants you liberty, God grants you total freedom. The enemy cannot threaten you when God has set you free. One of our greatest problems is that when we are faced with difficulties, we begin to murmur and we begin to complain. But here Moses is saying to the people, number one, fear not. When fear takes a hold of the life, one cannot think properly. One cannot behave as he ought to. Why? Because fear has gripped the life, and so he becomes irrational. Moses says there is no reason to fear. What you need to do is to stand still. What am I standing for? You stand on God's word. You stand waiting on God because you are no match for the enemy. The children of Israel, they were no match for Pharaoh's army. Yet Moses was saying to them, stand still. When you stand still, you can see the working of God all around you. So he says, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Have you learned to stand still and allow God to fight for you? You remember in the Old Testament, Gideon was faced with a crisis. God chose him to lead his people into battle against the enemy. When they gather Israel to fight or to be prepared for the battle, there were 30,000 men. But most of them were fearful. And so God told Gideon, let those who are fearful go home. And God passed them through a few tests. And the number boiled down to 3,000. God used those men, 3,000 men, to defeat an army many times their size. Why? Because they were ready. They were prepared. They were ready to go forward in the name of the Lord. Those who were fearful were eliminated. Saints of God, when you are fearful, God cannot use you effectively to fight against the enemy. So if you are fearful, you are not ready for battle. The Bible tells us that God guided Israel by a pillar of cloud by day. And that same pillar was a pillar of fire by night. And so as they stood on the banks of the river, and as the army of Pharaoh came close, that cloud lodged itself between Israel and the Egyptians. God worked that night, creating a path through the Red Sea so that his children can march forward. The Egyptian pursued him, and they were all drowned in the Red Sea. Moses said to them, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. For the Egyptians you see today, you would never see again. The Lord will fight for you. The first strategy in the Lord's battle was to create a safe path for his people. My friends, even though you may walk through the valley of the shadow of death, understand that God will create a path for your feet. And so they passed through the Red Sea. And as Egypt pursued, God confused the army. God confused the animals. And finally, that path that was created by the waters standing on either side of the path as a tall wall, the waters came back again. And every individual from that army perished because God was fighting for his people. As you go through life and as you go through your chores or whatever you have to do today, as you face circumstances and situations, even battles, remember, my friends, God is prepared to fight for you. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. If you attempt to fight your battles in your own strength, then there is no need for God to fight, and you will be defeated. But if you rely on God, allow him to work his way in your life and allow him to work out the situation that you are faced with. Allow him to work it out for you. My friends, you will be totally satisfied in the deliverance that God will wrought on your behalf. So today, I say to you, stand still. See the salvation of the Lord. The enemy is as a roaring lion, walking about seeking whom he may devour. He is capable of making a lot of noise. And that noise is capable of instilling fear in those who do not know God. You have been called by the name of God. You belong to God. You are his child. Do not allow the roaring of that old toothless lion to scare you. Remember that God is fighting for you. And if God be for you, who can be against you? So I say to you again today, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. May God bless you tremendously.